In this second lecture on Chapter E, I'll be talking about various things that have to do with figured bass symbols, because we haven't yet learned everything that there is to know about figured bass. So once again, I'll share my screen with you and I'll continue going through the handout. Figured bass can be used for a few different purposes, and one of these we've already covered in Chapter D. The purpose that we've talked a lot about already is how figured bass numbers can be used to show a chord's inversion, and also to show whether it's a triad or a seventh chord. Figured bass shows both of these things by showing the intervals above the bass of the various notes in the chord. So just to review, here are the figured bass symbols for the diatonic triads and for the diatonic seventh chords. A triad in root position is labeled with a 5-3, or more commonly, it has no figures because 5-3 is the default. A triad in first inversion can be labeled 6-3, but generally it's labeled just as 6 to show that there is no fifth above the bass, but instead of a fifth, there is a sixth above the bass. A triad in second inversion, which we'll soon learn is really what we call a linear 6-4 chord, is labeled with both the sixth and the fourth above the bass in the label to show that we have not a fifth but a sixth and not a third but a fourth above the bass. The figured bass symbols for diatonic seventh chords work the same way. We can label a root position or inverted seventh chord with the full figure having 3 numbers in it to show each of the 3 additional notes above the bass. Or we can abbreviate the figured bass to be a little bit more efficient. The abbreviated figured bass is 7 for a root position seventh chord, 6-5 for a first inversion seventh chord, 4-3 for a second inversion seventh chord, and 2 or sometimes 4-2 for a third inversion seventh chord. Okay, if you didn't learn these figured bass symbols thoroughly in Chapter D, be sure that you do learn them in this chapter. Okay, let's talk about some other uses of figured bass, and I'll show you examples of these in a minute. Figured bass is used also to show what accidentals are present in the chord. The default for figured bass is to simply use the notes that are in the key signature. But if you need to tell the person who's playing your music or the person who's reading the figured bass line that one of the chords in the upper parts above the bass is not following the key signature but has, let's say, a sharp or a natural or a flat on it, you can use the figured bass to provide this information. And finally, figured bass is sometimes used to show the particular voice leading in the lines or parts above the bass. Let me show you some examples of these. This is an example from page 74 of your textbook. It's example E.4. What you should imagine is that the note that's in bass clef is the note that's given to somebody, either somebody who's playing the chord progression on a keyboard instrument, or maybe just somebody who's reading a bass line knowing that it signals certain chords. What you would have to rely on is the bass note itself and then the figure underneath it. So let's look at each of these sort of funny examples with the numbers under the bass and suss out what they mean. We're in the key of C minor, and here is a G in the bass. Now, there are no numbers underneath the G, and that means that this is going to be a root position G triad. The 5 and the 3 are invisible. But when you have an accidental by itself under a bass note with no number next to it, the accidental always refers to the third above the bass, not necessarily the third of the chord. The third above the bass might be the third of the chord if the chord is in root position, but it could also be the fifth of the chord or some other member of the chord. But we're just thinking in terms of intervals above the bass. So anytime you see a natural, what that is short for is natural 3. Anytime you see a sharp below the bass, that's short for sharp 3. Put a sharp on the note a third above the bass. So we're going to realize this figured bass by writing the chord that's implied by the figured bass symbol. So above the G, we write GBD, and the note that's a third above the bass, which is the B, is not the B flat that's in the key signature. It has a natural on it, and it's a B natural. Here's another example from the key of E minor. There's a B in the bass. The only figure is a sharp. This tells us that this is a root position B triad, and the note a third above the bass would have a sharp on it. Okay, so the notes that we write above the bass are B, D, and F sharp, but the D is a D sharp, not a D natural, because of the sharp that's in the figured bass. Now here's a more complicated example. Now we have a 6 indicating that the triad is in first inversion, and this tells us that the G is the third of the chord. Now, if the G is the third of the chord, normally that would be an E flat triad, E flat, G, B flat, because of the key signature. But what we're seeing here is natural 6 and then a natural by itself, which remember means natural 3. So the note a sixth above the bass, which would be E flat, is actually E natural. And the note a third above the bass, which would be a B flat, is actually a B natural. Here's the same chord, but with flats indicated. It's a first inversion triad. C is the third of the chord, not the root of the chord. The note a sixth above the bass has a flat in front of it, so we're going to flat the A, and the note a third above the bass is indicated to be a flat note, so we're going to flat the E. There's no difference between writing flat 6, flat, and writing flat 6, flat 3. They mean the same thing. Now here's another symbol that you need to know. A slash through a number means to raise the note by a half step. So if the number indicates a note that is natural, we raise it by adding a sharp. If the number indicates a note that is a flat note in the key signature, we would raise it by making it a natural note. This indication, showing what to do with this E triad in second inversion, tells us raise the note a sixth above the bass, so make the G into a G sharp, and include the fourth above the bass, which is E. The slash through the 6 means the same thing that it means over here when we just put a sharp in front of the 6. Either one of those can be used and they mean the same thing. Another thing that means the same thing is to put a plus sign next to the note. So here, where we have a D in the bass, and underneath it we have 4-2 with a plus sign next to the 4, this tells us two things. It tells us, first of all, that it's a third inversion 7th chord, because the figured bass is 4-2. Then it also tells us that the note a fourth above the bass, that G, should be raised. So it's not a G natural, it's a G sharp. Figured bass can also show voice leading and even doubling. When we use the figure 8-6-4, we mean double the bass note. Have a note an octave or sometimes 2 octaves above the bass, in addition to the sixth above the bass and the fourth above the bass. These horizontal lines show voice leading. They show keep the note an octave above the bass even when the other voices move. Move the voice a sixth above the bass down to a fifth above the bass. Move the note a fourth above the bass down to a third above the bass. So you can see that the note an octave above the bass, this C, is staying where it is. The note a sixth above the bass, which is the A, is moving down to a fifth above the bass, G. And the note a fourth above the bass is moving down to the note a third above the bass, E. In a minute, I'll be turning to an example in the textbook, an example of a piece of music that was originally notated using figured bass. This piece is for flute and continuo is a word that you need to know. Continuo, which means the same thing as basso continuo or thorough bass, one is an Italian term, the other is an English term. Continuo was the combination of a bass instrument such as the cello and a keyboard instrument such as a harpsichord or later a piano. The continuo part would be read both by the cellist and by the keyboard player. The cellist would just read the notes like an ordinary cello line, but the keyboard instrument would read the bass line and the figures, improvising chords above the bass line following the figured bass symbols. Keyboard players in this time, that is in the 1700s, learned to play correctly from a figured bass line in the same way that a jazz pianist today learns to improvise from the chord symbols in a jazz chart or in a fake book. Okay, so let me turn to the textbook to show you this piece by Handel. This is the Sonata for Flute and Continuo, Opus 1, number 7, by George Frederick Handel. When the sonata was published, it wouldn't have been published in this form. There would only be 2 lines of music. There would be a line of music for the flute player, and then there would be this bass line with its figures that would be for the 2 continuo players, the cello player and the keyboard player. This is a modern edition, so the figured bass has been realized, turned into chords, reflecting what the figured bass says. Let's listen to the recording of this piece. The first line is fairly straightforward. You can see that there are a couple of chords that are marked with 6s, well, more than a couple. So here is a chord that has a C in the bass. This tells us that the C is the 3rd of the chord, so you can see that it's an A minor chord. Here's another first inversion triad. G sharp is the 3rd of the chord. It's an E major triad. And here are some more first inversion chords: E minor, D minor, E major. Anytime a G sharp is supposed to be used in the chord, it's reflected in the figures. So for this root position E major chord, we're reminded to include the leading tone, G sharp. When the G sharp is actually on the bass note, we don't need to put anything in the figure because the G sharp is already there, part of the bass line. Here's a sharp showing that there should be a G sharp in the chord. The note a 3rd above the bass has a sharp on it. And there's also both a 6 and a 5. The 6, as it turns out, isn't really telling us that there is an inversion happening. Instead, it's indicating the notes of the flute line, which have a C and a B. So we have first a 6th above the bass and then a 5th above the bass. It turns out that the 6th above the bass, the C, is a non-chord tone. It's not really part of the E major harmony, but it's passing to connect the D with the B. It's part of the counterpoint. The figures that are shown in measures 25 through 30 are a little bit more complicated. Here you can see indications that the 6th above the bass is raised. So this chord has above the A not an F natural, but an F sharp. Here, the 5th above the bass is raised, as well as the 3rd above the bass. This is a first inversion 7th chord. The full figure would be 6, 5, 3, but the 3 is invisible. Still, we know that the 3rd above the bass needs to have a sharp on it, an F sharp, to follow the figured bass. And here are more chromatically raised notes. The note a 6th above A, the note a 5th above B, and the note a 3rd above B. So that's how figured bass works in an actual piece of 18th century music that uses figured bass. The reason that we learn all about figured bass in this class is that later on, since this is a class mostly about harmony, you'll be writing a lot of chord progressions. And one way that I can indicate to you the progression that you're supposed to write out is to give you a series of Roman numerals. Another way that I can indicate a chord progression to you is to give you the bass line plus the figures, a figured bass line, and have you write out the chord progression that it represents. Let me give you an example. I've written an example up on the board. Okay, here's an example of a fairly simple figured bass that I've written on the whiteboard. Let's just go through it and see how we would interpret it. The first chord has a C in the bass with nothing underneath it. This would be a root position chord, so it would be a C, E flat, G. This chord, on the other hand, would be first inversion. There might be a B flat in the chord, but notice that that note, B or B flat, is the note that's a sixth above the bass, and it says natural 6. So there would in fact be a B natural as well as the D and the F. Now there's just a 6 under the bass, so this is telling us first inversion following the notes of the key signature. This would be C, E flat, G. So again, it's another C minor triad. This has a 7 and then a dash and a 6. So in the same voice here, we're going to have two notes. We're going to have a G going to an F. This G has a 6/4 underneath it, meaning that the G is the fifth of the chord. We're going to have a C, a fourth above, and an E flat, a fifth above. So that's going to be C, E flat, G again. And this G has a 5 and then an implied 3, but the 3 is natural. So this is going to be a G, B natural, D. Okay, so let me write the chords. That's what the figured bass told me to do as far as the chords. Let's see what that sounds like. Hopefully it won't sound too terrible. Now you know a little bit more about figured bass than you did. I'll be talking in the third lecture about texture.